Wheezy here is an extremely damaged engine case that's teaching us all about line boring and thrust cutting. So cash in your scholarship to the School of Rod Knox. It's the Hard Times engine build. I've measured all of the main bores and come up with some cleanup cuts. I don't think this first cut is going to do it, but that's okay. We'll get an idea of how deep it needs to be cut and then go scavenge for bearings. We'll base the final cut on those dimensions. Really trying to make this thing work. Did plenty of cutting up there on number one, but it was so offset, so we were probably cutting pretty deep in some of it and hardly at all in other parts. Let's get the bar out and see what we're looking at. Look at that. That's a lot of swarf. We did a pretty decent cut on something up here. Looking at the number one main here, it just barely didn't go deep enough over on this side. You can see our dowel pin hole there is kind of disfigured. This is the oil galley. This is a drain back galley here. It just drains into the case. See through there. This side we have a bit more to go. That's just how pounded this thing was. There's one spot in there next to the oil galley where number two didn't really get all the way cut, but that's all right because main bearing bores number 2, 3, and 4 are only about halfway to the first oversize, so reasonable to expect that that will clean up when we get all the way to the first oversize. Number 3 looks great. It's all clean, just needs to be finished out. And number 4 looks good too. So I'm going to go ahead and measure these just to check my accuracy. And then we might move on to the thrust. I was pretty much spot on, within 2 10,000ths for number 1, and the other ones weren't so close. Around 1,000th of an inch too small. And that would have put my bearing crush, if this was for realsies, in between 2 and 3 thousandths, which is a bit on the tight side. I'm going to stop there with the boring on this case. Where we are is needing third oversize on number 1 and to finish first oversize on 2, 3, and 4. That's going to drive some people crazy because the proper way to do this is to bore them all the same. There's 2 reasons that I would do it this way in the short term. Number 1, this is not a meaningful engine. Number 2, I've been collecting random sets of bearings or broken sets of bearings, and so I can mix or match. I would not break up a set of bearings for something like that. But if I've got a bunch of bearings that didn't cost me hardly anything that are already broken sets, well then there's an opportunity. In case you're wondering, we have picked, at least we've penciled in a case for the actual engine build, knowing that this one's not going to do it. This is the case that came with the double cab. It hasn't had much screen time on the channel, but there is a 68 double cab waiting in line. Oops, oh, my box is sitting up. But there's the bearings that are going to fit the one successful line bore that we've done. The problem with this case at this point is it needs a thrust cut. And Wheezy may be the case that teaches us. I believe I've made everything that we'll need to do that. We have this bushing that will be used to set the depth of the cut against the big bushing on the flywheel end. And we've custom ground some 3/16 inch round high-speed steel here into what I think will be an effective thrust cutter. So we'll learn how to use this on this engine case, and then maybe we can get the 68 double cab case all ready to go. I'm going to try a cleanup cut on the inside of the thrust surface. I want to minimize this. If we look at the oversized bearings here. They thicken the flange on the flywheel side. We can tell that from the dowel pin hole here. So this is the flange that's thicker. Thrust cuts are made at depth on the outside, so that's where we'll really do our thrust cut. But I like the idea of a bit of a cleanup cut on the inside, especially for something that's seen so much drama. I need to go really sparingly here because this will have the effect of moving the bearing out towards the flywheel. That'll shrink the stack of shims that we have, but most notably, it's going to play with the very small amount of slop that we have here in the dowel pin hole. I don't know if many of us have realized it or not, but that dowel pin hole is not snug in the bearing like it is in the case. So we have a little bit of room to play and maybe push that bearing out towards the flywheel a few thousandths, and we'll call it at that. I'm going to do this one by hand, so we'll go real slow. Okay, we have our thrust cutter set up inside. I'm just going to bottom it out on the existing surface in there, and we'll come over to this side and set up our bushing. I want to control the distance that it goes this way once I start cutting. Let's just do a skim cut that way. So who knows if I've bottomed it out at a high point or a low point, right? So we'll go ahead and tighten this and see if it slides all the way around and cuts anything. A little bit. Just on the one side. So I guess I'll skim cut until I feel it going around the whole thing. My smallest feeler gauge is 2/1000ths of an inch. So I'll use that. So everything's bottomed out with the 2/1000ths of an inch feeler gauge. So now I should be cutting about 2/1000ths of an inch. It's still not going all the way around. Let's go again. All right, that one went all the way around. I think that's worthy of a peek. Look at that thrust cut. I can see on the top, on this case half, the 3/4 case half, that it's not all the way down. But it sure looks a lot better. Let's go again. This is the value of a for funsies case. Okay, this time I'm going to ease into it a little bit. Well, I thought I was. Okay, I am going to call that cleaned up. Next we'll play with the outside. I've turned the cutter around on the bar. If I get to do it the way I want to, I'll be modifying a bearing for the case instead of the other way around. I'm gonna do what we did last time and just cut off the high spots. I think this is something I want to be really square and smooth. That felt smooth. Okay, let's see what that looks like. I think we're about to find out why we're in such terrible shape with this case. We never made it to the thrust surface. My thrust cutter hangs out a little bit further than the bearing, and that's all that we cut out of all of that. The thrust surface is way down here. And that's fine, we haven't messed anything up, we just have a lot further to go. We're going to be approaching that second oversize, I think. That's pretty deep. Let's measure it. Now I don't really have a square surface to take this measurement, so I'll pick right off the very edge here. That is 0.824. 1.5 millimeters pounded out. We're going to need a 2 millimeter flange. By the time we clean this up, we'll be down to who knows what. That is pounded out. Did a little more cutting. We have about 20 thousandths to go before we're down to this surface here. This is the old bearing. This is the inside of the case, and here's the thrust surface there. You can see it just pounded out the bearing too. That lip is rolled off. Look how thin it is at the very edge there. Just because there's kind of a contour on it now. It should have a square shoulder, and here it's just beat to the point that it's rounded off. And that kind of explained the deep round shape that we saw in the case also. So as I cut deeper, this lip here that's becoming the thrust surface gets a little bit wider and wider. I have about 20 thousandths to go. The good news is this appears to be working. Here's another 6 thousandths cut. Feels good. We are very close. That last cut did not feel too good, but we're all the way down. Let's see what the measurement is. We've cut a good bit off, about 1.5 millimeters. That's right at 0.806 thousandths. And it would have started originally at about 0.868. Things are going mostly well with the thrust cutter, but we have a bit of a problem. I took a measurement of the width of the thrust surface, and I found that it is skinnier here on the very edge than it is deeper on the thrust cut. So that means that the two cuts are not parallel to each other. What I think is happening here is this cutting edge along the bottom is actually tilted a little bit, and it cuts a little bit high closer to the end of the cutter. That's why we're a little thicker around the edge than we are around the bore. The difference in measurements here is 4 thousandths of an inch. Since I've cut the front and the back of this thrust surface, I'm going to say it's the same on both sides. So we have a pitch that rises 2 thousandths of an inch. That's a pretty steep slope. So now I got to figure out how I'm going to level that out. I can't think of any other way for me with the stuff that I have to fix the edge on this tool. I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to need a really light touch here, but I'll just take a guess and do a cut, see what the measurements are, and then go again if I need to. Overall, this is a very good thing. We need to figure this out before we work on the case that we intend to build out. If we don't, the bearing won't seat correctly, and it might cause more in-play issues. So, let's get it figured out. Okay. That's all I want to do for the first try here. I'm going to dress this up with the stone a little bit. I feel good about it. Now, because I've cut the front and the back of this thrust surface, once I get it right, then I'll need to cut the back side, and it should be flat at that point, or however close I'm going to get it. This looks a whole lot better than it felt. Let's measure it out and see if we've split that slope in half or something really close to it. 2 millimeters less than the stock width for this thrust is 0.788, and I may have cut skinnier than that. All right, minor dimension is at 0.793, so okay. We have 4 thousandths of an inch left. Oh boy. And our major dimension is 9.6. Hey, that's great, we're flat. I'm gonna put the cutter on the other side, do just a tiny cut, hope that we don't go below the minimum, and probably stop there if we're pretty close to having parallel thrust surfaces. It does appear to be cutting the most on the outside portion. I can see the cut line, that's good news. Just a tiny little sliver of metal. You can mush it in your fingers. Okay, let's act like that did the trick. This is going to be really neat if it works. This sure looks nice. It may or may not be to spec, but it looks nice. Okay, that is right at 95, and that's 93. So we cut our taper in half. That's 1 thousandth on each side. This one is at 96. And that is measuring out at 94.5. So this is great. Okay, I think I'm going to take that as a win. We've got our taper down to a couple of thousandths, and that's 1,000th or less on each surface, which doesn't seem too bad to me. I think I need to learn how to do the trim a bearing thing. So let's stop there with the case.
Check out this video to see how we scavenge some bearings and move forward. Things get even more sketchy, but we keep learning on the cheap and having a good time. See you in the next video.